So far in this reading series, we've talked a whole mess about passage strategies that you can use, simplifying, identifying function, things of that nature. What we haven't focused on as much is strategies related to the questions and the answer choices. So, a very important part of that is you first have to be able to identify the question type. And so the question type can be divided into various categories, which we'll talk about in these next series of videos. But the reason why this is so important is because if you identify the correct question type, you actually will apply a different skill. So some skills apply to some questions and some skills apply to other questions. Again, we'll talk about that in a series of videos. But step number one is you have to be able to identify the question type. Now, we have some question types that deal mostly with big ideas. So, we're going to start with the big idea questions because, in my opinion, if you read a passage, the big ideas are going to be a lot more important than those specific details, which we can always get through the scanning technique. And I think the big idea questions can be divided into four different types, two of which are more common than the other two. So the first one is going to be purely just a main idea question. What is the main idea of the passage? What is the main idea of that paragraph? That kind of thing. The second one is going to be what we call primary purpose. A lot of people confuse these two question types and say they're similar. They're really not. Primary purpose relates to what the author is doing, whereas main idea refers to what is the author's point. There's a slight, subtle distinction between those two. The less common big idea questions, number one, passage organization. Basically, what is the organization of that passage or that paragraph? And then finally, the fourth one is going to be paragraph relation. What this really means is how does that paragraph relate to the other paragraphs? What is the purpose of that specific paragraph in relation to the other paragraphs? For example, maybe the second paragraph is contradicting the first paragraph, something like that. So let's go ahead and look at some examples. So we're going to start here with main idea. A main idea question might be phrased in the following ways. Which of the following best states the author's main point? Another example would be right here. Which of the following best describes the central issue with which the passage is concerned? And the key thing about a main idea question is notice they're not really asking what the author's doing, but what is the author's main argument or what is the author mainly saying here? And of course, here we have central issue. So you will see little keywords like this that indicate it's going to be a main idea question. These are actually not as common as you would think. Much more common is going to be the primary purpose questions, but I forgot there was another one here. So here's another example. Which of the following best summarizes the main idea of the passage? But much more common is going to be the primary purpose questions. So these are a little bit different because, like I said, they're describing what the author is doing rather than the author's point. Here are some examples. The passage is primarily concerned with discussing. Now, how do I know that this is a primary purpose question? Because it's using this verb here, discussing. This is actually an easy one because they actually tell you specifically what the author's doing, discussing something. So in this case, you could almost say it's kind of a main idea question because the verb is already given. But you'll also see these questions phrased like this. The passage as a whole can best be described as doing right there. So do you see the verbs right here? Which means all five of the answer choices are going to be verbs. Is the author arguing something? Is the author, analyzing something, et cetera, et cetera. Another example, very straightforward. The primary purpose of the passage is to. Do we have a fourth example? Yes, we do. The passage is primarily concerned with discussing which of the following. So as you can see, the first one here and the fourth one here are very similar right there because they're both using the verb discussing. If you want to categorize these as main idea questions because the verb is already given, that's okay. I'm still going to categorize them as primary purpose questions because, again, the emphasis is kind of like what is the author doing here? What is the author doing? Okay, let's go ahead and move on to a couple of other caveats with primary purpose. So if you take a look at this question here, in developing the main idea of the passage, the author does which of the following? You might assume, oh, this is definitely a main idea question because it says main idea. I would say, hold up one sec. We have the word does right there. So again, the emphasis is on what the author is doing here, which means all of the answer choices would actually be verbs. All of the answer choice would actually be verbs. So again, I would consider this a primary purpose question rather than a main idea question right there. And then we do have one kind of fail-safe method, if you're always kind of wondering whether it's main idea or primary purpose, the thing you can check out is, do all of the answer choices begin with a verb? Take a look at this. So A says analyzing, criticizing, pointing out, proposing, describing, etc., etc. Yeah, so that is kind of the test. If you're just wondering, is this a primary purpose question? Just look for those verbs. Just look for those verbs. Okay, a couple other examples for passage organization and passage paragraph relationship. So passage organization would look something like this. Which of the following best describes the organization of the passage? Which of the following best describes the organization of the passage as a whole? What exactly does that mean? It basically means, what is the author doing kind of in order? So the author first does this, and then this, and then this, and then this. It's kind of like going to be a series of statements all related to the author's function or purpose. So you could kind of consider these purpose questions as well, but rather than one overarching purpose with primary purpose, it's more like first the author does this, and then this, and then this, and then this, right there. Again, not very common. These questions are quite rare, so don't expect to see these all the time. And then finally, we have what I refer to as paragraph relationships. What I really mean by this is they're kind of focusing specifically on a paragraph. You could almost think of it as a primary purpose question for just a paragraph. So the second paragraph of the passage is primarily concerned with offering. Notice how the verb is already given right there. The reason why I call them paragraph relations is because in many cases, you can determine the function of a paragraph by thinking about what the paragraph before and after it are doing, kind of the relationships between them. And then finally, I couldn't find another example, but you might say something like this, see something like this. The first and second paragraphs can be described as doing which of the following. So like I said, it's kind of a primary purpose question, but for the paragraph level. How do these two paragraphs relate to each other? Does one support the other? Does the second one contradict the first one? Etc., etc. So these are going to be, this is going to be the first video in identifying question type. And this one, we talked about the big idea questions. Why is it so important? It's so important, again, because the skill varies, the technique varies. So you do have to be able to identify these questions.